In 1620, while the Mayflower was in Provincetown, 18 of its men sailed in a small shallop, searching for a place to live. They came to present-day Eastham, where they were met by a group of Nauset. After a brief but violent encounter, the English left towards today's Plymouth. In 2020, we remember this first encounter. We explore its meanings for today and tomorrow.
The following text is an excerpt from Chapter 2 of Ian Saxine's book, The Story of the First Encounter at Nauset. Chapter 2 is titled English Paths Across the Sea. Facing these challenging headwinds, a tiny minority of Puritans came to believe that the Church of England was beyond saving, and that trying to take over their local parishes and bring about a reformation was impossible. In fact, they decided submitting to such profane, unchristian practice as remained in the local parish churches endangered their souls. So they took the radical step of forming their own independent congregations apart from the Church of England, an act that most people, even Puritans, believed was a dramatic withdrawal from their community. Separatism also defied English law and the monarch's authority as head of the church. It was, in short, not an undertaking for the faint of heart. A 12-year-old boy living in Yorkshire named William Bradford learned that for himself. After hearing the Reverend Richard Clifton preach about the crying need for further reforms in a neighboring parish, Bradford defied his family and continued to go gadding to additional sermons. Bradford began to meet in secret with other Yorkshire dissidents at the home of William Brewster in Scrooby. By 1606, the attendees formed their own congregation, separate from the Church of England and headed by Clifton and John Robinson. As they did so, authorities ramped up persecution of separatists. So as their former afflictions were but as flea-bitings in comparison, Bradford later wrote. To escape imprisonment, many members of the Scrooby congregation fled to the Dutch Republic, itself an illegal act, in 1607 and 1608. They gathered in the town of Leiden under John Robinson. In the Dutch Republic, the Scrooby congregation enjoyed relative toleration, along with religious refugees, including Portuguese Jews and French Huguenots. In Leiden, the separatists experienced challenges refugees have faced in many times and places. The English struggled to learn the local language, while their background as farmers left them ill-prepared to take advantage of available work in the trades. After a dozen years in Leiden, few English people had joined them, dissuaded by a life of hard work for low pay as manual laborers. Nor were the Dutch gaining by the congregation's godly example. Instead, many separatist children were led astray by what the English viewed as libertine locals, and the congregation feared that their children were in danger of losing both their souls and their English identity in this unfamiliar environment. So by 1619, members had decided to live as English colonists in America, at the northern reaches of the vast Virginia Company patent from King James, near the mouth of the Hudson River. Like most English people, the separatists believed they had a right to move to America, and that their king had a right to grant someone else's land away to his own subjects. Bradford described the continent as vast and unpeopled, while also fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants, where there are only savage and brutish men, which range up and down, little different than the wild beasts. Robert Cushman, another early Plymouth colonist, described it as a vast and empty chaos, when answering if the English had a right to be there. Bradford and Cushman used reasoning among common English people and many educated Europeans at the time. The fact that a location's residents lacked civil government, meaning laws that English people like Bradford found familiar, meant that they had no legal sovereignty to violate. Perhaps even more important, Bradford subscribed to particularly English beliefs about what constituted legitimate forms of landed property. English law by 1620 held that certain acts, specifically enclosure with fences, planting of agriculture, building structures, and residing in a place year-round, were sufficient to demonstrate ownership over an area where no one else had a viable claim. In their view, the collective, overlapping nature of Wampanoag use rights did not constitute true property. As stated by an early governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, what is common to all is proper to none. Nor did movable wigwams qualify as the sort of fixed dwelling place that conveyed legal title over territory in English law. The English were willing to acknowledge native rights to the fields they tilled, which even supposedly uncivilized people had held as a natural right, but considered the vast majority of indigenous property to be wastelands open for the taking. English definitions of property justified their incursions into the Americas, but also into neighboring Ireland, where English colonizers dismissed Irish practices of agriculture and animal husbandry, indicating the locals occupied a lower rung on the ladder of human civilization. In Ireland and North America, English colonizers insisted native occupants required tutelage, however harsh it may be, in the ways of civilized land use under English common law. The sites of battles and massacres pockmarking the Irish countryside stood as grim evidence of English willingness to use violence to make their vision a reality. A patent issued by King James to the Plymouth Council to New England in 1620, which later founded the colonies of Massachusetts Bay and New Hampshire, mentioned that by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, resulted in the depopulation of that whole territory, leaving them deserted by their natural inhabitants. As we have seen, the Wampanoag had not disappeared, but the myth of native disappearance from New England, leaving the English in empty wilderness, began before the Mayflower even came sight inland. Not for the last time, a shortage of separatists and a shortage of resources among those who were available for the trip to America forced the Plymouth colonists to recruit strangers to keep their venture afloat. They turned to a London ironmonger named Thomas Weston, who recruited a number of adventurers, financial backers, and non-separatist planters, additional colonists making the trip. Wrangling between the investors and the separatist agents delayed the colonists' departure, continuing even after the 102 passengers crammed aboard the Mayflower. The other ship, the Speedwell, was no longer seaworthy, set sail on September 6, 1620. Even though the separatists were the driving force behind the plan, they only made up about half of the passenger total, which also included 13 servants of church members, 31 non-separatists, and 6 of their servants. A crew of perhaps 30 men brought the tally of people on board the Mayflower to just under 150. The separatists who had started the venture sailed away without several important things. John Robinson remained behind in Leiden with the majority of the congregation, so the new colony would lack a trained minister until he joined them later, or so they hoped. The colonists also lacked a charter of their own, a royal permission slip that guaranteed their legal right to exist. Although they did not know it at the time, they would never get one. When the Mayflower landed outside of the bounds of Virginia in November off Cape Cod after a 2-month voyage, the colonists realized they had entered a legal limbo. The passengers who were not members of the Leiden congregation began to argue that outside of Virginia and the bounds of the New England patent, held by a different company, that they could use their own liberty to break away from the separatists. Cooler heads prevailed, and 41 of the male passengers, including 2 servants, signed a covenant for self-government, choosing John Carver, a leader among the separatists, as their governor. Under English law, these signers represented the wives, children, and servants who made up the dependent members of their household. The signers worried about surviving the winter and calming what Bradford called discontents and murmurings and mutinous speeches and carriage, so that the tiny company would not fall apart, and agreed to nothing more revolutionary than an English town government or a new church. The key clause for the moment was probably the oath of submission and obedience to any laws and ordinances enacted by their chosen governor and other officers. 2 centuries later, New England writers would rename this modest document the Mayflower Compact and celebrate it as the seed of Republican self-government in North America. The Mayflower passengers had different goals in mind. The adult separatists hoped to finally create a thriving godly community where they could raise their children and avoid the corrupting influences that had surrounded them in England and in Leiden. The non-separatist strangers looked forward to obtaining sufficient land to achieve competency, meaning a modest prosperity. The servants bound to both groups aspired to the status of free man if male and likely marriage to one if female. All of that, of course, depended on surviving the winter.
My name is Joanna Hollick. Thank you for your support of the Sunset Series and Eastham 400. If you're interested in supporting Eastham 400 efforts by purchasing commemorative items, we do have several items for sale on our website, eastham400.org. We are selling gold foil First Encounter ornaments, T-shirts with the Eastham 400 logo, and montages made by a local artist. The ornaments feature an image of the shallop and come with a special description card. The T-shirts are available in light blue, navy, and ash gray, and in sizes adult small through 3XL. The montage depicts watercolor images of important historic and well-known landmarks around the town of Eastham. Each of these items are $20. Thank you.